All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to discuss the legacy of Malcolm X. Now, equality in the United States has remained a controversial issue in our history. We have matured from our mistakes and achievement, yet at times allow the past to repeat itself. Racial tension and discrimination has defined our country for centuries and continues to denote our perfect country. Now, black and white racial tension has embodied its presence in the United States. As a result, many lives were lost and grudges were born. Throughout history, we have familiarized ourselves and distinguished ourselves with respected speakers such as Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. They have forever influenced the importance of equality regarding ethnicity and race. Due to this, races, particularly African Americans, have been forced to deal with unequal opportunity and poverty, leading to less honorable ways of living. Malcolm X is one strong example of a colored man who fell into this type of hate and acted against it, uniting people to promote the advancements of colored people and change. Malcolm X was a courageous advocate for the rights of African Americans. Through his adolescent years, contribution to the civil rights movement ultimately leading to his assassination, Malcolm X strengthened the notion for equality for African Americans. His noble actions created a voice for the African American people and a path to a new America. Malcolm Little was born during the Great Depression era. Work was scarce and hatred for the black community was high, making living conditions for the average African American difficult. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. Malcolm X attended West Junior High School, where he was the school's only black student. He excelled academically and was well liked by his classmates. He was even elected class president. However, he later said that he felt that his classmates treated him more as a class pet rather than as a human being. Malcolm was son to Louise and Earl Little, who was a Baptist preacher and active supporter of an organization that promoted the return of blacks to Africa. Malcolm, along with his siblings, experienced dramatic confrontations with racism from childhood. Lawrence A. Mamaya, author of Malcolm X Retrieved, states hooded Klansmen burned their home in Lansing, Michigan. Earl Little was killed under mysterious circumstances. Welfare agencies split up the children and eventually committed Louise Little to a state mental institution. Malcolm X was forced to live in a detention home run by a racist white couple. By the 8th grade, he left school and moved to Boston. This was an early stage in Malcolm's life where he began to have hatred on white people, and he often felt inferior to whites. In his early teens, he found himself in trouble with the law. Malcolm was drawn to street life in Boston, where he began wearing flashy clothes, gambling, selling drugs, and burglary. According to Manning Marable, author of Malcolm X, A Life of Renovation, he became known as the Detroit Red because of his red hair. And at age 20, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for burglary. While in prison, he began to transform his life. He was often visited by his brother Reginald, who informed him of the religious group known as the Black Muslims. The Black Muslims were an Islamic group whose official name was the Nation of Islam. Those teachings taught that the white American man was doomed by Allah, and they were often doomed by destruction. Also, the teaching stressed that the best course of black people is to separate themselves from a white civilization, culturally, politically, physically, and psychologically. Malcolm began copying words from the dictionary and developed a vocabulary that would help him become a passionate and an effective public speaker. Malcolm took the first step towards the belief of non-integration from white American people. According to the African American history, he was released in 1952. He renamed himself Malcolm X and he kept his word with Elijah Muhammad's belief that Black Americans should give up their slave names. Being completely illiterate, a criminal, and even worse, a black man, in that time it meant that you were less than a dog. Malcolm X began to take the incentive to lead his nation back to Africa. Malcolm X grew up in a white world where an individual was judged by the color of their skin, not by the content of their character. The killing of his father and the years he spent in prison helped him create an everlasting hate on white America. He used his religious practices and inner emotion to organize an uprising and argue for equality within the country. Malcolm X was a very well-read, reflective, passionate, and a visionary man who taught African American people the value of self-reliance, self-respect, and pride. He did that with a conviction purpose and clarity that was so rare at this time. Now, during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the black community received disadvantages from public services, education, restaurants, and at this time in the United States, there was a major movement for racial integration, or the bringing of races together in peace. However, Malcolm X and the Black Muslims were calling for racial separation. He believed that the civil rights gained made in America amounted to almost nothing. He criticized those African Americans who used nonviolent practices, that they were pointless and inefficient. In the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, Malcolm X's philosophies often clashed with civil rights activist Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He claimed that King's ideologies again were ineffective and pointless. Malcolm X attended many public gatherings, talk shows, and podcasts preaching the importance of equality across the nation, to break the shackles of racism by any means necessary, including acts of violence. Now, Malcolm X is seen as quite an inspiring individual. His admirers see him as a courageous human rights activist who campaigned for the rights of African Americans. His powerful voice for the people created inspiration for the Black community. Although his life came to an end, his dream for a Black Islamic America did not. Malcolm X soon became the most visible nationwide speaker for the Black Muslims. As the voice of an organization, he was a speechwriter, a philosopher, and an inspiring speaker who was often quoted by the media. His debating talents against the white and Black opponents helped spread the movement's message. By 1955, racial tension in America reached a boiling point, and white Americans became fearful of Malcolm X's message of Black supremacy. Louis A. DeCaro, author of On the Side of My People, voices how on December 1st, 1963, Malcolm X stated that he saw President John F. Kennedy's assassination as a case of the chickens coming home to roost. Soon afterwards, Elijah Muhammad suspended him and ordered him not to speak for the movement for 90 days. On March 8th, 1964, Malcolm X publicly announced that he was leaving the Nation of Islam, and he said that he was going to start his own new organization known as the Muslim Mosque and the Organization of African Americans Unity. He remained a believer in the Islamic religion, and he then made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He returned to America as Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, and in June 1964 founded the Organization of African American Unity, which advocated Black identity. On February 21st, 1965, 1 week after his home was firebombed, Malcolm X was shot 15 times to death by the Nation of Islam members while speaking at a rally at his organization in New York City. Now, although Malcolm X's life was constantly in danger, he was never phased. He was never phased by this. His passion for change kept him motivated. He was a courageous advocate for the rights of African Americans. Now, through his adolescent years, contribution to the civil rights movement, and assassination, Malcolm X strengthened the notion for equality for African Americans. Now, over the years, Malcolm X became a charismatic speaker for the African American community. He was an African American Muslim minister, leader, and a civil rights activist. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, Malcolm X became one of the most prominent advocates for the rights of African Americans. As a proponent of self-defense, he was able to strengthen the notion of equality and inspire African Americans to vigorously resist racism. Now, furthermore, his advocacy of Black nationalism successfully united African Americans at a crucial time during the civil rights movement. The legacy that remained following his death also encouraged the creation of movements whose ideas were formed from Malcolm X's. Malcolm X is a classical story of tenacity, adversity, and determination, and his result was triumph. Thank you for allowing me to give you my presentation.